get started. So it's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker for our distinguished seminar series. So Dr. Bei Wang. So Dr. Wang received her Ph.D. in computer science from Duke in 2010 and joined the Scientific Computing and Imaging Institute, also known as SCI, at the University of Utah as a postdoc and research computer scientist. And then in 2016, she joined the faculty of the School of Computing at the University of Utah as an assistant professor. Dr. Wang's research expertise lies in theoretical, algorithmic, and application aspects of data analysis and data visualization, with a focus on topological techniques. Her research interests include topological data analysis, data visualization, computational topology, computational geometry, machine learning, and data mining. Some of her current work involves studying vector fields, tensor fields, high-dimensional point clouds, networks, and multivariate ensembles, and uses ideas from topology, geometry, and machine learning. She has won numerous Best Paper Awards for her work at several conferences and has received support from NSF, DOE, and NIH for her research. And in 2020, she was awarded the very prestigious DOE Early Career Award. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Wang for today's seminar, and I'll turn the time over to you. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much for the invitation and the nice introduction. Today, I'm going to talk about hypergraph. And there's two subtopics. One is about topological simplification, and one is about co-optimal transport. And I will make that precise soon. First of all, I'd like to thank you for all my collaborators. Without them, this work would not be possible. And also my funding agency from primarily NSF and DOE for this work. So my collaborator from top is my PhD student, Jaccard, Chit, both from University of Utah, and Emily from PNW. Samir used to be at Stanford, now is at Revelio Labs. Tom from Florida State, and Tom's PhD student, Ethan, who's also from Florida State. And the work here is presented in two papers. One is upcoming TVCG paper on topological simplification of hypergraph with a more focus on data visualization. The second paper is right now on archive. The part I want to emphasize really is that all the work I presented today come with open source implementation. So feel free to play with some of those frameworks. And all the images are generated from those software. So on the high level, first of all, I also like to give a lot of credit to Emily, who first introduced me to the study of hypergraphs at she has project on Hypernetwork, and she's the one who get me first interested in this line of work. On the very high level, the work presented here present a very interesting intersection between topological data analysis, optimal transport, and data visualization. So at the intersection of those three areas is born out of the work I'm going to present. I also throw in some category theory towards the end for good measure. So let's talk about hypergraph. Hypergraph is generally considered something that we can use to encode multi-way relationship compared to graphs, which encode pairwise relationship. I would argue a lot of data in practice actually come from hypergraph. Here is a simple example. This is a hypergraph example that is modeling biological pathways. In this particular case, I have more than 1,000 nodes, and I have 10 hyperedges. So in this case, the vertices, which are the black dots here, correspond to genes, and the sort of the colored convex hole that enclose those nodes are hyperedges, which are pathways from the molecular signature database. So in this particular case, I have a hypergraph that encode sort of biological pathways. Specifically, it's encoding the relation between genes and then the biological pathways those genes participate in. Another one that probably perhaps people more familiar with when you first think about hypergraph is the idea of coauthor network. There's multiple ways of mapping this into a hypergraph. The ones I presented here are coming from the topic coauthor data set from the information retrieval area. Each of the hyperedge, which are those colored convex hole, actually corresponding to a single author. And then the vertices, which are those black dots corresponding to researchers who have co-authored at least one paper with the author. Again, as you can see that as my data become bigger, the hypergraph actually become pretty complex. Now, to familiarize everybody for the rest of the talk, I want to introduce a few visual encodings because my talk is very example heavy. So you're going to see actually a lot of pictures. So in this particular case, I want to introduce a visual encoding for hypergraph. On the very left side, you see this picture right here. This is what are typically considered as Euler diagram. Basically, the idea is I want to visualize my hypergraph by treating the hyperedges as a collection of sets. So I'm basically visualizing the set element as a black dot, and those, again, those convex hull as a hyperedge. In the middle is what I would call bipartite graph representation of the hypergraph. There's definitely two ways of sort of lay them out. The top one is essentially try to respect the position of the node in my layout first, but you can basically redraw it as sort of the classic bipartite graph. The left-hand side, the black are the nodes from the hypergraph. The right, the colored dots are representing the hyperedge, and then there's an edge connecting them if this node belongs to the hyperedge. Now, throughout this talk, you're going to see a lot of what I call the hybrid visualization, which is basically overlaying the Euler and bipartite visualization, that because I want to showcase the relation between the hyperedge and then the vertex. So in this particular case, I'm just superimposing the Euler visualization and the bipartite visualization. So again, the black nodes corresponding to vertices of my hypergraph, and then the color node are representing my hyperedge, and then there is a pretty vague connection if the node belongs to, or the vertex belongs to the hyperedge. Now, let's move on to the first topic. Why do we even care about hypergraph simplification? As you can see from the example I gave before, as the hypergraph become more complex, it became kind of hard to interpret visually. So one of the motivation for hypergraph simplification is try to simplify the hypergraph for both analysis and visualization purpose. From the visualization perspective, if we look at sort of the hypergraph on the left, I kind of want to reduce its visual complexity. In other words, I want to reduce the visual clutter so it's easier to actually interpret the hypergraph from visualization. But also, I would like to impose a simplification framework that also preserves its underlying structure as much as possible so that the simplified hypergraph can be used for downstream analysis. And of course, the simplification framework, I would like to provide some justifications, mathematical justifications along the way. So here is a very simple simplification of a hypergraph. This is actually what's called, vertex collapse, which we're going to see more example in the next slide. The idea is if I have a bunch of vertex like this, which belongs to the exactly same set of hyperedges, then I can contract them into a single node. This is called collapse. So for example, everything here is now, replaced by a super node in order to simplify the representation. But we go a little bit further. So again, let me just revisit what I mean by vertex collapse in a very small example. Again, in the case here, both of those nodes that is pointed by the black arrow, they belong to the exactly same set of hyperedge. So instead, I can merge them into a super node as what I show on the right. And here, when I merge node, I'm basically using this kind of ring, sort of this kind of concentric ring glyph to represent that this is a merging of multiple nodes or multiple vertices. And similarly, you have those three nodes right here, and you can also collapse them into a single node because, again, they belong to the exactly same set of hyperedges. You can also do what we call hyperedge collapse, is that if you have two hyperedges, remember now my color node represent the hyperedge together with the color of those sort of convex hull, those are two hyperedges that both contain the exactly same set of nodes. So I can actually collapse them together by using this pie chart to represent there's multiple hyperedges that is merged together. So again, I'm just going to collapse two hyperedge into one because they contain the exactly same set of vertices. So our framework is try to generalize vertex collapse and edge collapse in a unified framework. And specifically, the overall idea is quite straightforward, is we allow vertices to be combined if they belong to almost the same set of hyperedges, and hyperedges to be merged if they share almost the same set of vertices. So in a way that we're progressively simplify the hypergraph while preserving some of its underlying structure based on this basic principle. So there are obviously many different ways to visualize hypergraphs. I'm just giving some examples here. Noticeably, this one is what's called a bubble set visualization of hypergraph. It's also based on set visualization. Remember, each hyperedge is really a set. So it's called bubble set in a way you can almost think about, you know, all this, notice this particular green set visualization. It's almost think about, you know, you kind of wrap the set with bubbles. That's one sort of intuitive way of thinking about it. There's other ways to visualize hypergraphs. For example, in this case, it's going to take the hypergraph in the middle that is visualized through Euler diagram into the right. That is almost like the metro map, where each of the set became a particular metro layout as a sort of line segment. So there's multiple ways to visualize hypergraph. I just want to emphasize our framework can be combined with any hypergraph visualization to achieve the simplified results. The one work that is mostly related to our work is this work back in 2020 on using persistent homology guided graph layouts. And then that's exactly the type of framework we use to simplify hypergraph. I'm not going to go into persistence because we only care about zero-dimensional persistent homology, which has a much simpler representation, which I will give an example very soon. So here is a high-level overview of how we perform hypergraph simplification. So if I start with a hypergraph on the left, upper left corner, the first thing I do is I will map it to a graph representation. Specifically, I'm going to map it to what's called a line graph. And then what we do is to simplify this line graph by merging the most similar node with each other. For example, in this particular case, I'm merging, you know, my line graph is somewhat weighted, and then the weights, the thickness reflect the weights, and the thicker it is, the more similar those nodes are. So my simplification is following the principle that I'm going to merge the most similar nodes together first. So the one step of simplification is merging the blue node with the orange node, and therefore simplify my underlying graph in this way. And then once I simplify the line graph, I can translate it back and map it back to a simplified hypergraph. Now let's talk about what this line graph does. Probably a lot of you have seen this before. The line graph is simply looking at turning a hypergraph into a graph where the nodes represent the hyperedge and the connection represent the intersection relations between the hyperedge. So again, remember the hypergraph on the left, I have 5 black nodes, and it has 4 hyperedges, which are those color nodes. And the line graph is simply just having the nodes from that corresponding to the hyperedge, and there's a connection between those nodes if the corresponding hyperedge has non-empty intersection. For example, the red hyperedge and the orange hyperedge, there's no connection between them because there's 0 intersection, but the blue and the orange edge has a connection because the blue hyperedge and the orange hyperedge has non-empty intersection. Okay, so on the top is what we use to achieve what we called hyperedge simplification. Because remember, if I take my hypergraph, map it to the line graph, and I kind of merge node in the line graph, where because the node corresponding to hyperedges, that corresponding to the merging of hyperedges in the original graph. And that's how you achieve the hyperedge simplification. Now, in order to perform what's called vertex simplification, remember, I want to combine vertices when they almost share the same set of hyperedges. I need to go through a dual hypergraph. And then the dual hypergraph is fairly simple. Again, you start with a hypergraph, and then the dual of a hypergraph is basically switching the row between the vertex and then the hyperedge. So vertex in the original hypergraph become a hyperedge in the dual graph. And then hyperedge in the original hypergraph became a vertex in the dual hypergraph. And then what we call a clique expansion is simply the line graph of the dual. Okay, so if you take the line graph of the dual, which is a clique expansion, again, you can apply simplification. In this particular case, the nodes in the clique expansion corresponding to the nodes in the original hypergraph. So when I merge the nodes in this graph representation, it's corresponding to merging nodes in the original hypergraph. So if you start with a hypergraph here, you arrive at a simplification by specifically, in this case, this is the node that is merged. Okay. So the kind of object we're going to deal with are going to be line graph, dual graph, clique expansions throughout. And later on, we're going to talk about how to model those things as categories. So,
sorry, Bei, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, go ahead.
In the simplified line graph, the third picture in the first row, can you give some intuition for why a couple of the lines became thicker when you simplify?
Oh, yes, because you have you can in this particular case, there are several choices you can do. You can recompute. This is exactly the answer because the lines were Jaccard weighted line graphs. Okay. You can use other weights, but for example, in this particular case, A is my original hypergraph, B is my line graph. Again, each node is corresponding to the hyperedge, and then the weight is the Jaccard index between those two hyperedge. For example, E1 has 3 nodes. If this blue hyperedge has 3 nodes, the orange hyperedge has 2 nodes. If I take intersection over union, it's 2/3. So I have this weights on the line graph as Jaccard weight. Okay, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so now Jaccard weight plays an important role in our simplification. As I recall in the previous work, we actually can use those, we can use topological simplification. We can apply a topological simplification to a weighted graph. So let's say in the time being, I have this particular graph for now, and it's weighted by the similarity. So the idea is I want to merge nodes first with the highest similarity. So for simplification, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to take the Jaccard index, and which is its weights, and take 1/weights. Then what I can do is computing what's called the minimum spanning tree, which define an ordering of how those nodes are going to be merged with each other. And it turns out that the minimum spanning tree actually corresponding to the barcode for dimension 0 persistent homology. If you don't know what barcode or persistent homology is, don't worry about it, because throughout this whole talk, I'm just going to talk about the barcode which corresponded to 0-dimensional persistent homology, which can be computed through minimum spanning tree. But I would like to show you what this picture mean. Now, because I have a weighted graph and I'm going to apply simplification, and then this is what I call the barcode, and then the length of the barcode is proportional to 1/the weights. So for example, this is weighted as 2/3, which is the most similar piece, most similar pair of nodes in my graph, and I want to merge them first. So if I take the inverse, it's corresponding to the shortest bar, which is 1.5. This one is the second most similar one, and the inverse is 2, which is the second bar. So in the visualization tool, if you're playing with it, as I'm moving this to the right-hand side, I'm choosing a particular threshold I want to use to simplify my underlying graph. So as I go from left to right, I am basically processing some of those edges in my minimum spanning tree. So for example, going from the first to the second, because those two nodes are the most similar with each other based on some criteria, you merge those two nodes together. So I kind of simplified my graph a little bit by merging those two nodes. And then the second step is that the most similar ones are this merge node with this one, because it has the most highest similarity, and then they were merged together again. So you can do this in a multi-scale version to progressively simplify my graph. Going back to what I'm doing here in the overall framework, that is precisely this particular step where I'm applying multi-scale simplification of line graph or multi-scale simplification of the clique expansion, and then the top corresponding to simplify hypergraph by simplifying the hyperedges, the bottom corresponding to simplifying the vertices. Okay. So this is sort of how we run this process of simplifying at hyperedge at multiple scale through the line graph. So again, the top is my hypergraph, and then the middle row is my corresponding line graph. So what I can do is I start with a hypergraph, compute its corresponding weighted, Jaccard weighted line graph in this particular case, and I perform simplification in this particular case, node merging, combine nodes into supernode. First of all, those two are the most similar. If you actually look at this, these two nodes, actually they're most similar because they actually contain exactly the same set of vertices. So that's why they were merged together in the first step. And then second step, it happened to be all those blue, red, and green nodes are all very similar to each other with the same amount of similarity. So that corresponding to those three hyperedges to be merged together right here. Of course, once you are performing the line graph simplification at every stage of the way, you can always map back into the original hypergraph. So you get hypergraph simplification. Okay. Similarly, I'm not going to detail, it's the same thing. If I want to do vertex simplification, I just need to turn my hypergraph into the clique expansions through its dual hypergraph. So then I can again perform simplification of the clique expansion. And in this particular case, merging the most similar nodes together, which then corresponding to merging the most similar nodes together in the original hypergraph. So you can sort of perform topological simplification of hypergraph this way. And it's nice and simple because it's in a unifying framework and it's based on zero-dimensional persistent homology. Now let's give a real-world example. Recall our biological pathways. If I actually apply this framework in this particular case, I am going to do hyperedge simplification. So in this particular case, A, B, C, D corresponding to the 4 steps of my hyperedge simplification. Again, when I say simplification, I am merging 2 hyperedges together when they are deemed to be most similar with each other in terms of containing almost the same set of genes. So again, you can perform those 4 steps. And you can see how on the right-hand side, each time you simplify, it slowly reduces the complexity of the underlying hypergraph. But the interesting part of this is actually a really interesting takeaway is that if I perform this sort of barcode guided simplification, is actually recover the groups of related pathways. So the simplification gives me a hierarchical relation among those pathways, which are individually hyperedges. And for example, you can see that the 2 things that merge first are actually all related to the biological function related to interferon. It's some sort of biological pathways that is most related to each other. So you can actually validate how those pathways are related to each other through the simplification process. And it's in this particular example, is well aligned with some of those biological insights. In the paper, there's more examples, but what I mentioned at the beginning is that this is all implemented in the Hypergraph, this software that Yoja was the primary developer, and you can load your own hypergraph and perform those simplification. Here's the original hypergraph, here's a line graph, here's a line graph simplification, here is a corresponding hypergraph that is after some simplification, and here is the control, and so on and so forth, and here is the sort of hierarchical relations either among the hyperedges or among the vertices. Okay, so there's a lot to play with. Okay, let me move on to the second part. So the first part is very much motivated by visualization, by the desire to simplify hypergraph. And something that is missing from there is when you actually sort of transforming hypergraph, what is a reasonable metric to compare hypergraph? And then this is where optimal transport come in. So recall that, you know, when you think about hypergraph, they arise in not just higher order network analysis, but they might also arise in computer vision, geometric processing, and machine learning. I'll give some example very soon why hypergraph can be used as modeling process. In one of those situations, the question is, how do you compare hypergraph and how do you match hypergraph? So the motivation behind hypergraph matching is in the sense that pairwise relations are no longer sufficient to incorporate higher order relation among features in establishing correspondences. So in this particular simple example, I have a hypergraph on the left and I have a hypergraph on the right. right? This is actually, what I'm showing here is actually the hypergraph matching that match both hyperedges with each other. And at the bottom is to match node with each other. So this is why the word co-optimal transport comes in, is because when I'm actually comparing hypergraph, I would like to be able to sort of match the hyperedges with each other and nodes with each other simultaneously. And if you actually, later on, I'm going to explain this visualization a bit more, but really the color of the hyperedge corresponding to most highly probable hyperedges that is mapped to each other. And then this kind of pie chart really shows in this probabilistic setting how much, think about optimal transport is about Earth moving kind of thing, where how much mass from the first hyperedge is mapped to the hyperedge in the second. For example, in this particular case, if I zoom in a little bit, right here, this corresponding to the hyperedge from the second graph, it says that the orange hyperedge from the first hypergraph is matched with this much into this hyperedge, and then the green one is matched 75% into this one. So it's essentially a probabilistic coupling between the hyperedges. Similarly, it's a probabilistic coupling between the nodes. So I will come back to this example, but what the main idea I want to show is when you study hypergraph matching, you really want to think about how you match the hyperedges and how you match the vertex simultaneously. So the high-level picture, we kind of have a very smart name for our framework, which is called HyperCut, which is basically hypergraph co-optimal transport. So the framework, the key idea is we want to enrich a hypergraph with probability measure on its nodes and hyperedges. And also we want to encode relational information between the nodes and hyperedges that capture both its local and global structure. So by doing that, we can introduce a hypergraph distance based on co-optimal transport and study its theoretical properties. But also, we can also use in the same framework and formalize in what we have seen before, where remember, I keep translating a hypergraph to a graph, for example, line graph or clique expansion. We can formulate everything in a categorical language and study the functorial properties and Lefschetz bounds of this map. And I'm going to show some applications of this framework, not only in matching, comparison, but also in classification. And we're going to come back to the simplification framework we saw earlier. So here is a teaser image. That's what I mean by hypergraph matching arise in many other places, in this particular case, geometric processing. So let's say I have an object, which is my centaur, and also have an object that is my wolf. And I can imagine those objects to be kind of gradually specified into sort of like coarser and coarser resolution. Now, on the right-hand side, this is the result of calling our HyperCut framework. If I actually make a single call to our HyperCut framework, I can actually establish correspondences through the hypergraph matching that produces both low resolution and high resolution correspondences between those shapes. So what do I mean by that is that I have color that is imposed on the centaur, and I'm going to transfer the color to corresponding to the correspondences that is coming from our framework. In this particular case, in both high resolution and low resolution model, you see the head of the centaur is mapped to the head of the wolf, and then sort of the front arm is, the arms are mapped to the front leg, and then the sort of back leg is mapped to the back leg, and tail is mapped to tail. So this is sort of one potential application of using our framework to establish those shape correspondences simultaneously between low and high resolution models. Okay, so there's a lot of metrics that is already developed for hypergraph. For example, back in the 70s, the Hausdorff metric, which is basically looking at Hausdorff metric between sets. And then there's also MS distance between clusterings. Again, this is based on sort of set intersection and set union. There's also maximal similarity of sub-hypergraph isomorphism, and a lot of those problems falls into NP-hard type problem. So our framework is sort of in comparison, does not require hypergraph to be defined on the same set of nodes. So you can have two hypergraph that has very different structure, and it has nice metric properties. And we would argue that it offers more freedom to encode more structured information within the hypergraph. And finally, it will give rise to meaningful hypergraph matching. Well, I would not be able to do justice to the whole area of optimal transport. So I'm going to give you a subset of related work in this space, starting from the study of metric measure spaces, and more recently in the study of optimal transport metrics by people like Solomon. And then there's also Facundo Momoli also studied quite a bit of what's called Gromov-Washington distances to find correspondences between different spaces. And even more recently, there has been work by my co-author, Samir, and also Facundo, and also Tom, who's here, who have studied GW distances in comparing graphs through encoding the information in the graphs through adjacency or shortest path or spectral representations. And our framework essentially is trying to leverage the general co-optimal transport framework that is introduced by Redco back in 2020. And we want to specifically work with the multi-way relations between nodes and hyperedge, which are modeled as rectangular matrices. So you can imagine the relation between vertices and hyperedges are encoded in this kind of matrix form. All right. So what are some of those theoretical foundations? Let's go back to graph and talk about.
I think there's a question from the audience from contact.
Go ahead.
So it's just a quick question, Bei.
Yeah.
So is this exactly the network alignment problem? I'm just trying to make sure that I'm not missing anything.
So you can think about network line problem as graph matching, right? Then the hypergraph matching is essentially try to align hypergraph that encode higher order. Exactly. This is sort of the higher order version of think about them as hypernetwork alignment problem.
So that's where I'm trying to see I'm understanding it correctly. So you can always express it as a bipartite graph.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, you're trying to align two bipartite graphs. Is that correct?
It's one sub problem you can perform over there. In fact, we prove some of the theoretical property that is exactly along that line, but there is other ways of dealing with hypergraph that does not involve in translating it to the incidence by bipartite graph.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, but you're right on track, right? You can study hypergraph by studying the incidence graph, but there's other variations. Okay, so I would like to introduce the probability measure on graph. So I need to start with graph. So we know graph is set of nodes and set of edges, but then a measure network is now a triple where the X is a Polish space and the mu is a probability measure and omega is a bounded measurable network function. One way to think about omega is some sort of weight function that defines the pairwise relation between the nodes in my graph. That's one way to think about it. And we call it network function, but sometimes I also mention them as weights. And then we're going to denote this to be the set of all measure network. And then one of the most simple version of omega is just binary adjacency function. So let's look at a very simple example. I have the following thing, which I'm modeling as a measure network. So for each of those vertex in my graph, I have a probability measure that is uniform. So each of those nodes has 1/4 probability measure. And omega now is encoding just binary adjacency. So say because 1 is adjacent to 4, so the omega 1/4 is equal to 1, and 2 is not adjacent to 4, so it's equal to 0. So this is one way to encode pairwise relation between my elements in my space X. Okay. Now there is sort of a slight detour. If you have a two probability space, I want to define what's called a coupling. So a coupling is basically a joint probability measure on the product space such that the marginals agree with the measure on each of the subspace. So I like to have mentally this picture of the marginal distribution to kind of think about this. A coupling is a joint probability distribution such that this projection onto each space agree with the measure on that space. Now, once you have the measure network, you can define what's called Gromov-Washington distance, and here is the formulation. And then this is previous work. So if you have a pair of measure network as defined before, I first want to define what is a distortion. So the distortion is if I give this pi, which is this sort of coupling, I would like to sort of looking at the sort of the p norm of the difference between the omega, which think about omega as weights or the network function. You basically want to aim to reduce this distortion. So again, going back to the classic optimal transport problem, you want to find the transportation plan that minimize the distortion or minimize the cost of transportation. So that's not surprising. So you can define the GW distance between measured networks to be over all possible coupling, which is looking at all possible transportation, that transportation plan that reduce this distortion. Okay. So in our specific setting, is that if I achieve the optimal coupling, it will provide a soft matching between the points in the measured network. So when I say soft matching, it really means that one node is matched to two other nodes, one with say 0.9 probability and one with 0.1 probability. That's what I mean by soft matching. Now I'm moving quickly from graph to hypergraph. So remember, hypergraph also has a set of nodes and a set of hyperedges. So what we define actually in our framework is what we call measure hypernetwork. Now, because it's slightly more complex, now I have 5 elements that define a hypernetwork, where X is my set of nodes, Y is my set of hyperedge, and mu and nu is sort of probability measure over those things. And then the omega is again what I call hypernetwork function. If you think about in the setting of hypergraph, it's kind of describe relation between the node and hyperedge. Okay. So again, I can refer to it as hypernetwork function or weight function. So let's start with the first example. Obviously, any of the hypergraph can be modeled as hypernetwork. In the next slide, you will see hypernetwork is actually much more general form than hypergraph itself. So if I have a simple hypergraph in this particular visualization here, it has 5 vertices, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And my probability measure on the nodes are uniform, so it's 1/5. It has 4 hyperedges, so the probability measure on it is 1/4, again, uniform. Now I can define what is my omega. The simple one we have described before is incidence relation. So it can be represented as this matrix. So my rows are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. My columns are A, B, C, D. And specifically, my hyperedge A contains 2 nodes, 1 and 2. So there's a 1 in this sort of matrix representation. The second way of actually encoding the relation between nodes and hyperedge, this is where the flexibility comes in, is if I want to encode some other sort of information, either local or global information of my hypergraph, I can use what's called shortest path relation. So again, on the right-hand side, this matrix here is now saying that for a particular entry, X and Y, X be a node, Y be a hyperedge, is the length of the shortest hyperedge path from any hyperedge Y prime containing the node to the hyperedge Y. So essentially you are performing a shortest path walk this way, and then you can use the shortest path relation, and then that gives rise to a different omega or different hypernetwork function. Now, as I mentioned before, hypernetwork has many other examples, does not necessarily have to come from hypergraph. For example, if you just give me a measure network, I can simply duplicate it to make it into a hypernetwork by just duplicating the second space, also as X mu. Well, why would you do that? It's up for debate. The second thing is that you can also think about any sort of data matrix can be modeled as a hypernetwork, where the X can be a set of samples and Y can be a set of features in a machine learning sense. And then the mu and nu are data-dependent distributions on the sample or on the feature, and omega is a value of the feature observed on the sample. That's one way to think about this can be modeled as a hypernetwork. The last one is more generally, is that if X can be the data space, so for example, n-dimensional Euclidean space, and mu can be a distribution in this data space, Y can be a parameter space, let's say R of M, and nu can be a distribution representing sort of constraint on the parameters. And omega can be a parameterized family of machine learning models. If you do this, then my hypernetwork can be used to encode a machine learning problem. Okay. All right, so but in this talk, we're not going to go in this direction, but I would like to mention that hypernetwork, the notion of hypernetwork is much more general than just coming from your traditional notion of hypergraph. Now, same thing as before, as a direct extension of the co-optimal transport framework, you can now define co-optimal transport over hypernetworks. So again, you have a pair of hypernetworks. You first define the distortion. So again, you want to minimize, you might minimize this distortion, but in the distortion, you have P norm of the omega versus omega prime, but also you are looking at those two terms, which are exactly the coupling between hyperedges and the coupling between the nodes. And then this is sort of optimized simultaneously because in your actual distance, this is minimized over all coupling between the nodes or coupling between the hyperedges to reduce the distortion. So the really important part is to try to find those optimal coupling of both the nodes and the hyperedge simultaneously. And once I achieve the optimal coupling in the hypergraph setting, this coupling corresponding to the soft matching of node set and hyperedge set. And here's an example. In this particular case, I have a pair of hypernetworks where in this case, my information I use to encode I'm actually using degree information to encode the distribution, which I will also describe in detail later if we have time. But I want to show you what is the optimal coupling that we achieve from the computation. The coupling we actually obtain in here, this is the coupling between the edges. So the top, each of those hypergraph has 4 edges. So if you think about this is the edges, hyperedge from the first one, A, B, C, D. This is the hyperedge from the second one, which is A, B, C. Sorry, the first hypergraph has 4 edges, hyperedge, the second one has 3. So if you actually look at the coupling, let's just focus on this particular node here. It says that if I'm looking at this particular column right here, that there is a small amount from the orange hyperedge that is mapped to this hyperedge, and then there's a bigger amount from the green hyperedge that is mapped right here. Okay, and this is the optimal coupling between the corresponding vertices. Let's again just focus on one. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's just look at this particular 5, the 5th node. And if you look at the corresponding column, it said it has a tiny amount of matching that is coming from the second node right here. So there's a little bit tiny purple right here, but most of it is coming from the brown, which is node 5. Okay, so this is what you obtain when you actually optimize to try to find this distance. Now let's talk very quickly about I'm running a little bit late, but because I guess I still have time for question because I got some question in between. So let's just recall the measure preserving map. If I have a measure preserving map, it's just to say that, you know, it's really just in the mapping itself, it preserves the measure in the following sense. So I need to define 2 things. If I'm giving 2 hypernetwork, I can define them to be strongly isomorphic. If there exists a bijective measure preserving map, that map sort of think about, again, it's easier to think about it as a vertex set and hyperedge set. That has an inverse and specifically the relation between the nodes and hyperedges is preserved through this mapping. So that specifically says omega prime under this mapping is equal to omega from the original hypernetwork. Okay, so this is what we mean by strongly isomorphic. So now remember, we introduce this specific GW distance, which we call hypernetwork distance, through the co-optimal transport framework. What we can prove that is this is a pseudo metric on the space of hypernetworks. And moreover, if two hypernetworks are strongly isomorphic, then this distance is equal to 0. Okay, so that is the first. I'm not going to proofs. The proofs are in the paper. If you're interested, feel free. We can talk offline. That is the first property. It's a pseudo metric on the space of measure networks. But let's do a little bit more. We can also define what's called weakly isomorphic. So two hypernetworks, measure hypernetworks, are weakly isomorphic if their distance is equal to 0. Then what I can do is I can study the space of measure hypernetwork by quotient out the equivalence relation. So this is what I mean by the space of weak isomorphism classes of measure hypernetwork. So I kind of study this, this particular space. If I study this space, then the hypernetwork distance induces a metric on this space. And furthermore, this is something more geometric about this space, is that our particular distance is now defined on this metric space. This metric space is now complete and geodesic. So it comes with pretty nice behavior. All right, finally, let's talk about categories. And we invented this thing called graphification. I think it hasn't been used before. So if it has, let me know. So again, this goes back to the original motivation when people study hypergraph. They want to convert it to a graph, because there's more tractable structure with the graph. So you can perform hypergraph analysis by analyzing those graphs, okay? So there's several candidates you've seen throughout this talk, and I want to say there's more than those candidates, but I'm just going to use this as examples. You start with a hypergraph, you have this bipartite representation, which I'm now going to refer to as incidence graph. I have the line graph, and I also have the clique expansion. So the idea for the rest of my talk is I'm going to talk about how do I map from the category of hypernetwork to the category of networks and study that particular functor and study the property of that functor. So sorry, there's a little bit sort of bookkeeping. So in order to define the category of measure hypernetwork, I need to define what is a morphism. And this is first fairly generically that I'm going to use this symbol H to represent the set of measure hypernetwork morphism, which basically is a pair of maps that maps between the vertex and map between the hyperedges. And then whenever I want to specify a category of measure hypernetwork, I need to make a choice of what this morphism really looks like. Similarly, if you have sort of measure network, I can also treat it as a category by specify a set of morphisms. Okay, so of course, for measure network, I only need to specify the mapping between the node set. Okay. Now, this is a first example of a particular type of category, and this is called expansive category of hypernetworks. So it's the specific morphism we care about, preserve edge containment. So if you forget about hypernetwork for a little bit, just go back to hypergraph. If I have a pair of hypergraph and I have a morphism between the vertex set and edge set, such that it preserves the edge containment, which means that if I have a vertex that is in the hyperedge from the original hypergraph, under this mapping, the mapped sort of set of vertices also has to be a subset of the mapped hyperedge. Here is a picture view. Theoretically, that, you know, like 2 and 5 are elements of this blue hyperedge, and this blue hyperedge is mapped here. And for simplicity, let's say both 2 and 5 is mapped to 7. So because 2 and 5 are elements of here, their mapped one is also element of the corresponding thing. So it's just really saying that I am preserving sort of edge containment through this morphism mapping. If this becomes harder to understand, there's a very simple version of this expansive category is under the setting where let's say my 2 hypergraph has the same set of vertices, And my hyperedge are basically different type of cover. So this is basically saying that, the cover has to be becoming larger and larger to preserve the containment relation. And if you are aware of the line of work that people use to study multiscale mapper graph, this is referred to a map of covers. So the map of cover is another notion of this sort of morphism. Now, if I have this edge containment preserving morphism, which I call expansive category, then I can define what's called, I actually want to define expansive category now between measure hypernetworks. So in this particular case, it's again a pair of maps such that the omega relation is only increasing. Okay. Again, a very simple example is when omega is a binary incidence relation. So if X is an element of Y, it's guaranteed that the mapped node is element of the mapped hyperedge. So a simple relation, a simple type of omega is again coming from binary incidence function. Now, given such an expansive morphism, then I can talk about expansive category of hypernetworks. The second type of category of hypernetwork is what I call measure preserving. And the definition is quite simple. If I have a pair of hypernetworks such that both of the map phi and psi are measure preserving maps, then that is a measure preserving morphism. Then given this morphism, I can define what's called measure preserving category of hypernetworks. Okay. So now I have to give you two examples of categories of hypernetworks under different choice of morphism. Now let's go back and talk about what is some of those properties. The first property is that if I have a hypernetwork and I map it into the dual hypernetwork by a simple sort of inverse of the edge hyperedge relation, then we say that this dualization map, which takes a hypergraph to its dual, is a covariant endofunctor of this category, where this category can either be expansive or measure preserving. And it's, in addition, is a isometry of the pseudo-metric space. Okay. And this is really, well, it's not too surprising. It's essentially if I take a hypernetwork, map it to its dual hypernetwork, that the distance is preserved, assuming this category are both either expansive or measure preserving. Let me go a little bit further. This goes back to the graphification. Remember, I have multiple candidates where I take a hypergraph to a graph. So I now want to study the map between the category of hypernetwork to the category of measure network. And specifically, I define something called HN graphification is a factor between those two categories that is Lipschitz with respect to the distance in each of those space. And this is sort of the Lipschitz condition, okay? So this is, again, is a very generic framework. You need to choose what sort of morphism you use to define the category. So let's look at the first one, which is binary incidence graph. And this goes back to the first question. I can take a hypernetwork, map it to this incidence graph, and I need to be a little bit careful how the probability measure is designed. So if I have a hypernetwork and I map it to a measure network, the measure is defined this way, and the relation is defined this way. Okay, it's sort of intuitive in a sense. And if I use this particular mapping, I can prove that the instance graph is a graphification under both expansive category for both hypernetwork and measure network, or the measure preserving category, and the Lipschitz constants is 1. Okay, so that's one type of example. We can do a little bit further. I don't know if I have time, but we can do a little bit further. We can kind of make it even kind of offer alternatively. We can actually study a specific type of incidence graph, which we call bipartite measure network. And in that case, we have a specific design how the probability distribution is done, where each bipartite part has 50% of the probability measure, and then anything in one side has no relation, anything on the other side has no relation, and across is basically symmetric. So this is precisely the encoding of a bipartite graph. So now under this, I can define what's called bipartite measure network. There's a bit of things you can talk about coupling and so on and so forth. In the space of bipartite measure network as designed here, we can again define what's called labeled GW distance. So there is a corresponding sort of distance between them. Then the sort of result we have, this should be definition, this should be a theorem, is that under this specific class or category of bipartite measure network, there is this sort of instance map that takes a hypergraph to its instance bipartite graph is isometry. Okay, but we can do more. Remember, we talk about line graph, right? So I want to study what is the property of this functor that takes a hypergraph to its line graph. So I will start with some very naive definition of how the probability distribution looks like. So in this particular case, because I'm going into line graph, so you can notice line graph only encode hyperedge. So my measure y and nu get carried over. So the question is, what is my omega for the line graph? And one way to think about it is that it's described relation between two hyperedges, which is two nodes in my line graph. One way to define it is I want to integrate over all vertices of the relation between vertex x to the first hyperedge, vertex x to the second hyperedge, and integrate them together. This seems to be a reasonable thing that kind of describes the relation between the nodes in my line graph. And there is a corresponding matrix representation of this. But it turns out if I try to do this, this is not a well-behaved thing. So this particular map now is no longer Lipschitz, and it's not functorial for the expansive category. So takeaway message is that if you want functoriality, there's some care has to be taken into consideration to design principled graphification. So this leads to a slight modification. And the only modification you need to do is in modifying the sort of this map, we want this omega, now is omega hat, to be formed somewhat normalized. Under this normalization, if you're interested, I can tell you why it is. It's going to take more than several minutes. But the idea is if you actually are careful in transforming a hypergraph to its quantity line graph, and be careful how you control the relations through the omega, then you can prove under this modified line graph map, it is a graphification and it's also Lipschitz. Well, the definition it has to be Lipschitz. It has a Lipschitz constant of square root of 2. And with respect to a metric in the space of hypernetwork in the space of measure network. Finally, just mention quickly, we can do the same thing. You can take a hypergraph, category of hypergraph, or category of measure network, measure hypernetwork to the category of clique expansion. And you can use a similar thing to show that this is now a valid graphification for measure preserving category. So everything I presented so far is just an example of how you can play with those category language and looking at different ways to convert a hypergraph to graph and look at the property of such a map. I'm just going to show quickly, we look at this example. This is one example of simple hypergraph matching. The probability distribution is proportional to the degree of the nodes. And then the other omega is Jaccard weighted shortest path. I want to show you here, if you actually run 40 different, if you generate 40 simulated hypergraph, you can use our distance to do hypergraph classification. This is just showing that I have 40 different hypergraph coming from 4 different classes. And this is a pairwise distance metric. And our metric is able to recover essentially the original class from the ground truth. And finally, coming back to simplification. One of the most important questions is what is the right level of simplification you want to do? And this is a curve of comparing the GW distance as you simplifying it. And what you're looking for is some sort of plateau behavior to say that, okay, you know, at this or maybe elbow behavior, so that you can kind of decide what is the right level of simplification so you don't deviate from the original structure too much. Okay, and now you can use this hypergraph distance to help you guide the simplification level. Okay, so this is just a recap. Last slide. I think this is a very interesting landscape to explore further. at the intersection of topological data analysis, optimal transport, and data visualization. Once you have this metric, you can automatically compute things like Fauché mean for the space of hypernetworks. There is a lot of application in machine learning. And also you can think about scalable deployment into deep learning pipelines. There is a bunch of other things you can do with graphification because there's multiple different ways to translate a hypernetwork or hypergraph to a graph. And you can study the property, what you're actually preserving throughout this transformation. There's the other way around, which we're currently working on, is hypergraphification, which is taking a graph and translate it to a hypergraph, and again, study the behavior of that functor and see if there's a family of Lipschitz maps you can do. I actually forgot to mention the whole reason I want to study Lipschitz maps is you want the transformation to be somewhat controlled. So there is nice transformation between those two categories. So that's it for my talk. Sorry for going over a little bit. Here are my references, and I'm ready for questions.
All right, thank you very much.